Welcome to City Built Sessions. I'm your host, Irvan Augustine, and this is a show where we talk about the people building the businesses, culture, and institutions and ideas that shape our cities. And today's conversation is really about something every city depends on, but we don't always stop to think about. Who tells the story of our city? For decades, that responsibility has largely belonged to local newspapers, television stations, reporters embedded in communities that they cover. Today, that landscape is fragmented. Is that fair to say? Or changed?
Absolutely.
Businesses have their own platforms. Elected leaders speak directly to the public, sometimes just tweet. Podcasts, newsletters, and creators are shaping the conversation, but having a platform is not the same as earning trust. And when an organization faces a crisis or a major moment of change, the words it uses, the things it chooses to say or not to say, can have a lasting impact. And my guest today understands that from many sides. George Haj has spent decades in journalism in newsrooms, including the Miami Herald, the Houston Chronicle, the ALM Media, leading coverage of Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Ike, and even the Enron trials. He later made his move from journalism into entrepreneurship and founded Haj Media, a Miami-based strategic communication firm specializing in media strategy, crisis communications, and regulation management. Today, we're talking about journalism, trust, crisis, business, and the way cities tell their story. George, welcome to City Built Sessions.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here today.
I did not realize that you had done, covered so many of those stories. It was actually really fascinating reading a lot of the coverage.
That's a nice way of saying I'm old. But yes.
I'm just a couple minutes behind you and actually knew all those stories. So it was really interesting. But one of the things I did read when I was looking through your some of your bio and other things, you actually weren't interested completely in starting in journalism originally.
No, actually, I didn't start in journalism. I was thinking I was going to go to law school. My parents wanted me to be a lawyer. I was at Miami-Dade, and I happened to take a journalism class. I needed an English elective. I always loved to read. I always loved to read newspapers, but I never thought of myself as a journalist. And this is the happenstance that can happen in college and at a place like Miami-Dade.
Yeah.
I happened to take a journalism class. I got very excited. They sent me out to do an interview. There was Harry Chapin, if you remember the singer,
yes,
Cats in the Cradle.
Yes.
He was in Miami to do a fundraiser.
For all the kids watching on YouTube, you can Google who that is.
Yes, Harry Chapin.
Cats in the Cradle.
Cats in the Cradle. Amazing singer and a amazing philanthropist who devoted a lot of his time to causes he believed in, including hunger. Anyway, so he was at Miami-Dade doing a fundraiser for a congressman, and they sent me out from the class to go interview him, and I was like, wait, I get to go interview, talk to interesting, important celebrities, other people, get exclusive access, write about them, tell that story to the world. And I got hooked. And from then on, I focused on journalism at Miami-Dade, then at the University of Miami, where I was the managing editor of the school paper, and then started a 30-year career in journalism.
Wow. And one of the other things I saw is that that kind of also affected your view of the world is you mentioned taking family road trips and reading different newspapers in different cities along the way. What did reading newspapers from other cities kind of affect how you saw different communities or understood them, or how you think they understood themselves?
Yeah. Well, you have to remember at the time there's no internet. There's actually television is mostly national. So you just saw what was in front of you locally. And so, Miami in the 1970s, 1980s was becoming a, more Hispanic city. Driving through the country, we used to drive to Toronto, Canada, where my mother's family lived. So we went all the way up north. And yeah, I'd pick up a newspaper wherever I went, and also abroad. When we were abroad, I'd pick up an English language newspaper and began to understand that each community is so different. They have different types of people. They have different issues. They have different needs. When you're growing up, you tend to think what's in front of you. It's sort of the version of today's internet bubble, if you will. And so I was always fascinated by reading newspapers and seeing what the different perspectives were around the country, and in those days also listening to talk radio, AM radio was another source. And again, back in the day for you young people,
those were the original podcasts.
They were the original podcasters, and and if you fiddle with the radio late at night, you might pick up a radio station from Orlando or Tampa or somewhere else and get some different points of view. So it was some early lessons in understanding that every community is a little bit different in this country, or a lot different in this country,
and also many times the same.
Yes, absolutely.
And then early in your career, you covered the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. I don't know where you were, at what level you were in your career when you're covering that.
I had been a reporter for 4 months. That was my career.
Into that.
Yeah.
Wow. What did that teach you about the responsibility as a reporter covering a disaster like that? Because I remember watching that and just watching the news coverage and reading different things about it. But for you, from your standpoint, covering that story, one of the words that comes to mind is responsibility, because it is a heavy topic, but at the same time, you have a responsibility not just to share what happened, and if it bleeds, it leads. There's other elements of that I think nowadays doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I think, yes, absolutely. I mean, it was some very early lessons in treating subjects with sensitivity. I ended up talking to some of the astronauts' the families of the astronauts who had perished in the crash. Some of the NASA workers who had seen it and were terribly traumatized by it. Talking to people in the community, because I was working right next to Kennedy Space Center at the little newspaper there, Florida Today, and and they understood a shutdown of the shuttle program meant no jobs,
right?
Meant possibly extended layoffs. So
broader economic things that
correct the broader economic impact, because once when you got through after the immediate crisis, it realized there's not going to be a space program for a year or two or more.
Right.
And you had a community there that was almost totally dependent on that. And so it was a very, very quick lesson in empathy and sensitivity. And, fortunately I was able to work with some more senior editors and writers who were able to, guide me in, how you talk to a grieving family. One time I gave news to a grieving family that NASA had reported that they had found remains at the bottom of the ocean before NASA had called them.
Wow. You're the first one to deliver it?
I'm the first one to deliver it. That also was an early lesson that in the power of media and in the information we can get, and that, like many people, I had the idea that government knew what it was doing and was going to be doing it well and efficiently. And this was an early realization that, maybe not. And in this case, the first people they should have called were the families. And instead it was me.
Yeah.
And that was a very, very difficult conversation. And yes, I think those were some very early lessons in being very careful in how you talk to people, how you write about it, understanding that when you write a story, yes, you're writing for the broader community, but there are family members who are impacted. And the fact is also a lesson that which I've applied throughout my career is just because people tell you something doesn't mean you have to print it. People in grief, under stress, not used to talking to reporters, may say some things that you don't necessarily have to write. And again, I think we're in a different era now where basically everything that comes out of somebody's mouth, it goes straight.
There is no filter or even time to think. It's just out there.
Right. Yeah. And that, maybe we'll talk about it later, is that I think that lack of filter and time and for reporters to do the kind of discernment and thoughtfulness about how they approach it is vanishing in a lot of spaces. But yeah, I think there were some very important early lessons for me there in how you deal with people.
Yeah, good. That is really interesting, and I think it probably was the same for the other Andrew or Ike and some of those other disasters that happened. And also the other aspect of it too is I think that you get to see how the community responds in those moments in time, and I hadn't thought about the fact that you delivering the news. I think many times we have a perceived notion of how things happen. Maybe you watch too much Law and Order. Right. The police go first, and then all this other happens procedurally. Right. But in the end, I think you as a reporter or journalist in those moments, you digest everything for people, the broader public, and before you present it. How did those reporters that you were working with before, kind of help prepare you to kind of step into this new work, especially this being 4 months into the job? Well,
they were very good. Most of them had, not gone through a shuttle explosion, but they had gone through different disasters, crimes, murders, natural disasters where people had been, affected, and they gave good advice on just sort of how to, gently open a conversation, how to really listen. Sometimes that also means being, a little persistent. There's a fine line if you're a journalist between, you certainly want to respect people who are suffering, but your job is to get the information, and sometimes, you don't always take no. You might go back the next day,
right?
And sometimes when people think about it after going through a difficult situation, they realize, I want my story told. I want my family member's story told. I want people to understand this person's life. And sometimes it's a little bit of work to get there. Yeah. And so, again, sometimes people's first reaction is, no, I don't want to talk to you. But you keep pushing a little bit. Yeah. You need to. And sometimes people still won't talk to you, which ultimately is their right. But what I did find, what people did tell me, because at the beginning when somebody told me no, I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm done. That's it. And the more experienced reporters would say, no, go back, because oftentimes, as I said, people want their family members' stories told to the world in the right way. Yeah. So give them a little time to think about it. Go back or go talk to their uncle, go try some other paths before you give up here. And it was true. Most of the time, in fact, almost all the time, people ultimately, want to tell that story. I think, what I much later in my life now as a communications advisor, what I tell people, the thing I've learned from the very beginning is, especially in a disaster or in a major situation or a crisis situation, somebody's going to tell your story. Somebody's going to tell a story about you. Right. The question is, do you want to be able to have some control, some impact on what that story is so that it's told correctly and framed properly? And I think that was a lesson from the very early days that I still communicate in my work today. Somebody's going to tell your story. Do you want it to be you, or do you want it to be somebody who doesn't have a clue about you?
I think that's true for everybody, kind of in terms of owning that story. And for you as a journalist in those moments and times too, one, I think it's interesting, I guess I hadn't really thought about it. In terms of journalistic training, you focus on the writing and the story, but the skill set and the experience of dealing with people and pushing for a measure of truth and pushing to articulate that, I think is also really important. What is something else that people underestimate or don't understand about journalism from your perspective?
I don't think they, again, you say journalism these days, and there's I think even then there's still a very wide gamut between reputable publications and
there's all the tabloids and others.
The tabloids. Yeah. There was always the national. There was always the National Times and the National Enquirer, right?
Yeah.
So those extremes were always there. But I think what is unappreciated is, the amount of time that good reporters, good editors spend trying to get it right. I remember just hours of debate and rewriting and internally,
right.
do we have this story? Is the framing correctly? Is the sourcing correct? How confident are we of what we have here? In the early days of any disaster, whether it's a hurricane, a shuttle explosion, something else, a mass murder, whatever tragedy. Things that quickly come out are often wrong.
Yeah.
The number of people affected are often wrong. I mean, how many times have you seen a news report that, there's some kind of an awful situation and it's like, well, there are multiple shooters, and there never was. There was one sole person. So you have to be really careful, and there's a lot of debate in newsrooms about, what do you put forward? And again, I guess I was fortunate to work mostly in a world where you weren't pressured to put something out on Twitter 30 seconds after it happened. We literally had all day and most of the night to try and get it right. And even in the early days of posting stuff in the web, and I still think most, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Miami Herald, good publications, are very careful. So I do think, people tend to think, reporters, they've got an agenda, they're just writing it, they're just pushing it out there. There are layers and layers of editing that goes through it. So I think people don't recognize that. And I think somewhat they're affected by, again, in the current culture, influencers, people on social media, 24-hour news on CNN and Fox.
Yeah. All those, the majority of them are considered entertainment, technically. And I think that us as consumers and audience, we decide that that's our news source. But many of them don't categorize. They don't categorize themselves as official news. They may say it, but half the time there's a disclaimer at the end. This is not real financial advice, or I'm not but in the end, in this day and age, whatever comes first that's in your specific tiny worldview, that becomes your only news source.
Well, that's true. And I always urge people, and especially when I talk to younger people, is, read a lot of different news sources.
Yeah.
I look in this every morning, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, very conservative, Bloomberg, business publication. I love to read the Financial Times because it gives its, newspaper out of Europe, which gives the European, mostly European, but international perspective on events, both American events and international events. And I think looking at all of those things, the BBC is terrific. I mean, they're even if you don't want to subscribe, there are free outlets and places that you can go to give you a variety of sources. People these days say, where do you get your information? Well, I get it, from the internet. I get it from TikTok. Okay, but where do they get it? Because if you go back, it almost always goes back to
somebody else who
people are calling these unworthy national news sources. Yeah. It goes back to what was in the New York Times. It goes back to what was in the Wall Street Journal. Now, people take their own spin on it and they take it elsewhere. But ultimately, these things, most of the time, you go back far enough, there's a real reporter and a real editor
someplace,
who
yeah.
has done the work there. And I think people's obligations these days should be to, go back to those primary sources, see what they said. I talk to people, especially younger people, and they tell me about the latest conspiracy theory or something they saw, and I'm like, no. So it's I think that, and some, I think it's starting. I see in some universities, even some schools, there are classes on sort of news literacy and on kind of trying to understand
that's interesting.
where trying to understand what you're getting and how to vet information and review it so that you kind of know what you're looking at.
It definitely is a skill set, and I think that everything you're kind of highlighting is a little bit of the shift of where the responsibility of that originally, like you were originally, digesting that information and sifting through it and finding that truth. A lot more of that responsibility is now on us, the consumers,
Right.
Especially if there's not time. Like, you don't have time anymore in many of the newsrooms. Your news cycle changes every 10 minutes, so you have to get that out.
Yeah.
So you don't have time to.
Yeah, you're pushing out these days, even at large, very well run newsrooms. There's an expectation if something happens, you're pushing it out very, very quickly, and you're pushing out snippets of what you're learning as you're learning it, and you have to do that these days. It's what the public expects. If you don't do it, other people are doing it. But I think what's lacking is, we as consumers should, let's go back once all the facts are in and read that story that actually put together all of them in some context. And, instead of cherry picking, one of the things I think is unfortunate in not just journalism, but in social media these days, it's like there's so much reaction to anecdotes, right? It's one story of one person's experience or one little thing.
Yeah, and one aspect of the situation.
Right, one aspect of the situation. When I was in newsrooms, it would be like, if I went to an editor and said, I'm going to write a story on this one thing that happened to one person, the editor would roll his eyes and go, okay, but is it a trend? Is it really happening across the board? I mean, this is awful, but we don't want to suggest that, it means there is some crisis in government or healthcare or whatever it is. It may be a really horrible personal story, but let's not say it's indicative of what's happened. And the problem is now, I think what you see, if any of us look at our social media feeds, is we're inundated with these like little individual nuggets without context of what does it really tell us about the world or about the industry that is being written about or the situation that's being written about. And I think that's one of the real challenges these days is to sort of, because we all see, and the social media is built to outrage. It is built to get a reaction from you. So
I think we all forget that.
Every
really
nugget,
every on the reaction.
Right, every piece, everything, the ones that get a lot of hits. And unfortunately, this is what's driving in many cases media is, when I started in journalism, I mean, it's not that you didn't pay attention to what was selling papers. You certainly did. But that's a big shift from that to newsrooms having, monitors up with a list of what stories are getting the most clicks.
Right.
Well, we know what's going to get the most clicks.
Yeah.
Sex, violence, sports, news of the weird. That's going to get the most clicks. It's not going to be, is government working for you well? It's not going to be, the amazing breakthroughs in healthcare. I mean, those stories will do okay. But if all you're doing is chasing what is most popular, what is going to generate clicks, I think we all have a pretty good understanding of what that range of coverage is, and it's about this wide.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're 100% right. And then, fast forwarding in your career, and then you shift into, you went from journalism, corporations, courts and energy, and then moved into your own private practice. What are some of the elements from your journalism that you took into your business? But actually, I'll take a half a step first. Like, what inspired you to start your own business, actually?
People always ask me, it's like, what was your business plan? I was like, I didn't really have one. I was sort of at, like many of us get at certain times in our life, a bit of a pivot point career-wise. I had been in journalism in some very senior positions for almost 30 years. I didn't want to move again. I had worked in Miami and then Houston and then back, but I didn't want to move. This was pre-COVID, where remote work really wasn't going to be an option, and there was really nothing in South Florida journalism that was available that I wanted to do at the time. So, like a lot of people who eventually end up being entrepreneurs, I sort of had one foot in, one foot out for a while. I was like, well, I'm going to look for jobs, but in the meantime, let me start doing some consulting.
Right.
And I started doing that and met with law firm leaders, business leaders in town, and folks started giving me projects, and it started going really well. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do. I've set aside the corporate job, and decided, the only idiot I want to work for is me right now, and went from there. So it's like, again, I see this a lot. It's I have enormous respect for people who build out a really thoughtful transition plan to go from job A to entrepreneurship. But secretly, I think a lot of people are sort of like me in that you kind of got to a pivot point.
I was like you, and you just got to that pivot point, and you're just like, either jump or don't, and you make that. And
I jumped, and I've been blessed that the business has grown very well. Have never had a down year, even during COVID, and 95% of my business is referrals. People who know me, like my work, refer me to other attorneys, other companies, and so it's been. I've been really blessed with that. So that's why I made the jump. To your question about what I carried from journalism into running a strategic communications firm. At the end of the day, it's all storytelling. At the end of the day, whether you're telling stories on behalf of the public, going out and learning what's happening with corporations or a disaster or state government, and you're telling that to the public. In this case, the prism is simply shifted. I am working with attorneys, with corporations, with nonprofits. How do we tell your story to the world? And a lot of that is the same kind of, deep reporting, trying to understand, what is my client? I always start with, excuse me, not what is my client's communications objective, but what are their business objectives? What are they trying to accomplish in the market? Or for a nonprofit, who are you trying to serve in the community? What are your goals over the next year or two? Because how you tell the story, and more importantly, who do you tell that story to? It is driven by who are you trying to reach? Are you trying to reach investment partners? Are you trying to reach consumers? Are you trying to reach fellow peers? If you're a law firm, you want to kind of, show your prowess to other people in the legal community. Who are you trying to reach? Yeah. So again, a lot of those things are, follow from journalism into my business work. I mean, I'm fortunate in that, in addition to covering a lot of disasters along the way, I was the business editor at the Miami Herald and the business editor at the Houston Chronicle, and so I was fairly deeply immersed in business. I understand business and financials. I kind of speak their language, and so it wasn't a tough transition for me to go to a law firm leader or a business leader and say, I'm well equipped to understand what you're trying to accomplish here and help you tell your story. And I've got the benefit of having been on the other side and knowing how to interact with journalists.
And people.
And people, and then navigating navigating this new world, as you mentioned at the top of your show, of, podcasts, influencers, social media, niche publications, blogs. The journalism world has both shrunk in terms of the large publications having far fewer reporters available,
far fewer funding,
far less funding, far less ability to travel, to do research, to do other things. But from my point of view now, if I'm working for a company or a nonprofit, the flip side of that is it might be tougher to get in the Miami Herald because there are fewer people. But there are great podcasts in town. There are great, when I work with lawyers, there are all kinds of niche publications for legal. Daily Business Review here in Miami, Law 360 nationally, American Lawyer, Bloomberg Law. There are a variety of niche products these days.
And as you said, speak directly to the audience that your clients are trying to engage and reach.
Right. If you're in the healthcare business, or if you're in banking, you may want to reach the local business community, but you also want to be in the American Banker to be seen as part of your peer group in what you're doing there. So again, it's become more difficult in some ways in that, I didn't do this work 20 years ago, but, it used to be if you were in Miami and it was a Miami story, you were hitting, the Miami Herald, the Business Journal, the community newspapers, the 3 or 4 local TV stations. And that was pretty much that was it.
That was a whole ecosystem.
And now, how many podcasts are here? Let's just start with podcasts. They're really terrific platforms for people to tell their story here. And in addition, there are local podcasts. There are also podcasts around every industry you can think of as well. Again, as well as blogs, newsletters. So it's become, again, both tougher and easier to get your news out. You just have to, you have to hit a lot more outlets and, and sometimes the trick is frankly is convincing clients that, who might still be stuck in the mindset that, okay, when am I going to be in the Wall Street Journal? Well, not for a good long time, especially if you're a startup or, a young company. But
that speaks to what the ecosystem of journalism is today, because the barrier to entry is so low for so many other things.
Right.
And so I think a lot of folks don't even realize to get into the Wall Street Journal or be considered newsworthy, there needs to be something behind it.
Oh, there has to be. I a few times, I've been approached by startups or very young companies, and in almost all the cases, I told them, you're wasting your money to hire me or anybody else because you don't have a story yet. You don't have a real
That's why they hire you to make the story.
I'm supposed to make the story.
Just make something up.
And Theranos. There are people who have, there are things that have
people have made careers out of it.
That have made careers out of it, and it's not that if somebody doesn't have a great new product or a great idea, that you can't generate some coverage. But what I often tell them is, I might be able to help you get a couple of stories, but then after that, it's going to, you don't, again, unless you have you're further along enough in your company cycle to actually be generating something that might approach news. You probably shouldn't be hiring a PR firm. You should probably be focusing on your own platforms, your own website, your own social media, your own connections with people in your field to start there. Because unfortunately, I do see people, who do get very frustrated because they hire somebody with the expectation that there's some, miraculous way to get coverage. Yeah. When I talk to prospective clients all the time, often, they're like, well, do you have good connections in newsrooms? And I go, I have great connections in newsrooms. I practically grew up with these people. And then I look at them and I say, it means nothing without a great story behind it. If I go to my friends at the Miami Herald, some of whom I've known forever, and it's a lame story. The only advantage I have of knowing them is they might tell me it's stupid rather than just ignoring my email. That's about the only advantage I get.
Because it doesn't help them in the end to put a lame story. Because in the end, they have a job and a business they're trying to run too.
And at the end, that's a great point. And at the end of the day, my job is to align my clients' interests with, outlets that are interested in that story and figuring out how do we tell this story in a way that the Miami Herald will care about, which is going to be different than the way the Real Deal or the Business Journal care about, which is going to be different than, the way a podcast might care about. And so even if it's the same core story that we're trying to tell, if I just send a generic, and unfortunately there are people who do this. If I send a generic pitch or press release to 100 outlets, that's not going to do anything. What works is, going to the Miami Herald and saying, this is a story with strong Miami connections. It's in line with what you're covering now, which is very different than what they might have covered 10 years ago.
Yeah, very
based
different.
On staffing,
right?
And based on they have look. Like any newsroom or all the newsrooms that have gotten smaller, they have become more targeted in, we are covering X, Y, and Z and doing it as well as we can. And the Miami Herald does a brilliant job in many areas. But that means there are a lot of things that they're just going to say, we don't cover that anymore, George. We just don't do that.
Yeah.
And that's knowing that is part of the value. Again, it's not that I know reporter X, and so he's going to write whatever I give him. It's in knowing, here's what reporter X is covering right now, and how do I write the most compelling pitch so that he bites on it?
What does businesses or other folks get wrong about understanding what makes something newsworthy? Just because it happened does not necessarily make it newsworthy. Just because it happened doesn't make it newsworthy, and just because it's fascinating to you and your company does not make it. About you. does not. If you have some, sometimes you have this new HR policy or something that you're doing in the company that you think is just extraordinary, and it might be great for your workforce. But unless it is something really new in the market, I can't convince anybody that they should write about that. The other mistake people make is they want stories just about them. And that's very, very hard to do. Unless you have an amazing product or some, a really amazing initiative. But what you can do is, set up your executives as experts who can be quoted in trend stories, regularly. So if you are a person that a reporter knows, if I'm writing about the latest, some new issue in banking, that George has a banker who he can easily get on the phone with me to talk about that. And that banker then is regularly seen as an expert. He's on podcasts, he's being interviewed about these trend stories of some new regulations, some new laws from Congress, whatever it might be. That is a lot of value, but it's over time. Right. We're in a society where people want quick hits. And again, that can be tough. Like I said, I might be able to get the Miami Herald or let's say the Business Journal to write one story about the brilliance of your company. But once I've done that, it's really hard to get them to do more unless there are a lot of new developments. But I might be able to get that CEO regularly interviewed in those publications when they're talking about either their industry or the general business climate in South Florida or whatever it might be. So it's a lot of my work is to kind of reality check the businesses in terms of what we can do. And sometimes what we can do is heavily dependent, I'm not a magician. It's heavily dependent on, do you have executives who have the time? And often the answer is no. Often the answer is, X lawyer does not have the time to get on the phone with a reporter
regularly to talk about something. They're too busy, with their practice, which is perfectly reasonable. But what I find, if it's a big enough organization, what I urge executives is, there usually are a few people who both have the skills and the knowledge to be able to serve as sources and like seeing themselves in the news, and so are willing to make the time to do this. It may or may not be the CEO. It may be some other executives that you figure out how to place in a way that helps get your company out there, so that, my view is, all cover, even if you are one quote in a story, that's going to pop up in Google when somebody searches for your company or in AI search. And AI is actually really interesting. Can I talk about that for 1 second?
Of course.
So if you look at the AI search algorithms, it was for a while that companies moved away from, not moved away, but because it was more challenging to get into, earned media, to get into newspapers and TV, et cetera, they're like, well, we're going to produce our own content on our website. Well, the AI algorithms, though, are rewarding earned media. They like things that are basically that provide that third-party validation of who you are and what you do. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't build your own kind of corporate newsroom. But from an AI standpoint, and we all know where things are going with AI, they are really focusing on the earned media hits have a lot to do with what gets picked up in AI. So there's a bit of a shift now among communications professionals and companies that maybe we do need to focus more on earned media, because that's what AI is using to write about us, less the 5 blogs we're doing a day on our law firm website.
It makes a lot of sense. And the word crisis gets thrown around a lot. What makes something a real crisis, much less a communication crisis where they need to hire a person like you? I think a lot of people don't always understand, and me just as a layperson just watching the news, even more immediately, Taylor Farms and their lettuce and other things like that. To me, that felt like a communication crisis that someone needed to go help them at some point to kind of get ahead of the story. But it just felt like it was getting worse just watching it. Aside from them saying explosive diarrhea every 10 seconds on TV.
Yes. Well, that is a challenging one. So, I mean, obviously that is a true communications crisis. But, a lot depends on the size of the organization and whether you have the ability to kind of think through ahead of time. If you're a big enough, any organization, if it scales to a certain point, will eventually have a crisis communications issue. It may be with, a product recall. It may be with an employee suing for somebody for sexual harassment. It may be an issue of workplace violence. When you get big enough, stuff happens. Yeah. And so it's really, I think, incumbent on firms to at least be thinking about how are we going to communicate that publicly. Many companies are big enough that they have people internally to do that. But, crisis communications, that often that gets outsourced to somebody like me or somebody else who has experience just in dealing with media and dealing with a crisis situation and helping them decide what to say, when to say it, who should say it. Again, in a perfect world, companies, what I always advise companies is, let's spend a little time when you're not in crisis and think through, okay, when there is a crisis situation, who is our spokesperson? What is our matrix for decision making on who should speak? Not just who should speak, but what we can say, because in today's environment, you don't have 2 days to sit around a table and decide what's our statement going to be, or are we going to give one? You're going to have to move within hours or less and bring together your communications staff, your legal staff, human resources, often a bunch of different stakeholders to think through what can we say here. And often what I see, and I've written a little bit about this, is, legal is, the lawyers are looking at it from one of view of, we don't want to say anything if we can avoid it because we're going to get sued and anything we say might be used against us. The communications team is often looking at it and going, okay, we understand the legal risk, but what does it matter if your reputation is ruined and nobody wants to do business with you? And so ultimately, what I often try to do with my ongoing clients is, create a structure where, you're elevating this discussion to the CEO or to the top executives. Because really, at the end of the day, the CEO needs to balance that legal risk and that reputational risk and decide how much are we going to share, how much is this going to affect our reputation. And by the way, and the reason I say HR needs to often be a part of this is, it's not just external, it's your employees. And figuring out, in a crisis situation, it's not just figuring out how do you talk to the media about this. It's figuring out how do you talk to your employees about this to reassure them, to make sure they are not spreading incorrect information. If you're the kind of company that, you have inbound calls to a call center, how are you preparing the call center for incoming phone calls about your product or whatever it might be? So it really is, when I work with people, it's multidimensional. It's looking at, who, again, this gets back to what we talked about earlier, is looking at the audience. What are the different audiences that we need to communicate with? Internal partners or investors, again, call centers, and then media, and making sure, not that it's got to be the exact same message across the board, but it needs to be consistent across the board. Because if your employees are seeing something different in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times than they're seeing from your communication to them, they're going to wonder what on earth are you doing here. Vice versa, you don't want to communicate so much to employees in a way that if somebody shares that with media, it's going to create challenges for you. So it can be very complicated to look at that entire matrix in crisis communications of internal, external partners to figure out how do you get that messaging right and how to make it consistent across the board so that when you figure out, okay, our message is, this is a minor issue, this is going to get resolved, or again, if there's an issue, God forbid, of, let's say, workplace violence, you're trying to reassure your employees that this is a safe place. You're trying to get accurate information out to the media. So it can be very complicated. And again, I think the mistake when people think crisis communications, they're only thinking about what are you going to put on, how are we going to talk to CNN about this? And
there's a whole bunch of other layers.
There's a whole bunch of other layers that if you're going to do this right, you need to think through, because at the end of the day, you want to get through that situation. You want the media coverage to fade, but you also don't want to lose your best employees. You don't want to lose your business partners or investors, right? So it's multifaceted in how you approach it. And, good companies bring a lot of people to the table to have those discussions. Because, if I'm in a meeting, I have a lot of information, but I don't always know how something might resonate with, a hospital employee who's actually working in the emergency room every day, or somebody, that is something HR or somebody else is going to have to bring to the table of what do they need to hear.
Right.
And so, there's no magic. You bring in a crisis guru and they solve it. The job I see it for me is to help, convince them to let's get all the right people around here. Let's figure out what we can say to protect the company's reputation, but also to protect them legally. You don't want to say something that, helps you in the short term, but is going to end up with you facing a class action suit because of the way that you said it. So, these are difficult issues. And like I said, at the end of the day, I think ultimately it's not really my my decision or legal's. It's really the CEO or the top executives have to look at it and, weigh all the different factors and make some decisions on, how do we respond to this situation? And every company is different. Every crisis situation is different. I've worked on some crisis stuff with nonprofits that, have to do with the situation in the Middle East and the employees getting worked up about X action that seemed to reflect a company point of view on the Israeli-Palestinian issue,
and it differs from theirs internally too,
right? And you're never going. There are times when a crisis is. To your point, sometimes the crisis is cleaving the organization internally. It's not just an external thing that you're communicating with the media, but again, this is some work I've done with nonprofits. Is that you have some of these really emotional issues that have come up over the last few years. George Floyd, Me Too, the Israel-Palestine issue, that the way companies have sometimes dealt with them have created not just, public perception issues, but enormous divisions within those organizations. And so that can add a different layer of trickiness to the situation. And again, ultimately, the CEO, the board has to decide, what do we think is the right thing here? Because again, if you've looked at things, they're without using names. I mean, I think we've all seen a number of organizations that have been bitterly divided.
Yeah.
On some of these issues, and again, that's a very different. When people think crisis, they think again Taylor Farms. Something happens. How do we deal with media? But sometimes you have a situation where your staff is split.
Yeah.
Or most of your staff disagrees with you.
Yeah, and all that comes back to conversation and how you engage around it.
Right.
Last question for you, and I know that you don't just deal in crisis all the time. Mm-hmm. You guys, I say you, the collective you, just because you're on the board of the Gable Stage and also Mosaic Miami. Mm-hmm. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts around some of those. I know you had some recent wins, but how do you pick some of the work or projects you choose to take on in the work that you do?
Yeah. Well, those are, Gable Stage Theater at the Biltmore and Mosaic Miami, which used to be the Miami Coalition of Christians and Jews as an origin 95 years ago. Those are nonprofits where I'm honored to serve on the board. I'm the chair at Mosaic Miami, and I'm on the executive committee at Gable Stage. When I was in journalism, I always wanted to do more in the community, but the ethics rules prevented me from generally speaking, you can't serve on a nonprofit board because when I was at the Miami Herald, we might cover them at some point. Right. So
it'd be a conflict of interest.
So it'd be a conflict of interest. So I couldn't do that. So when I started my firm 9 years ago, a couple of years in, I started looking, where can I serve the community? My son was out of college and done, and I had a little more time. So Mosaic Miami, I had met Matt Anderson, the brilliant executive director there, and we started talking. I love the work that they do around interfaith and community building and bringing people from different perspectives, different ethnicities, religions together for genuine conversations. And joined the board there. And then around the same time, actually, Gable Stage, I actually was hired to promote the new artistic director 5 years ago, Barry Newport, when she was brought in. And I actually just, really was compelled by her and the mission of the theater, and joined the board there. What nobody had told me is how much work being on a nonprofit board
it's a lot of work.
can be. I probably should have asked some more questions, but I made the mistake on both of saying, not a mistake. I'm just teasing. On both boards, I said, look, I'm happy to make a financial contribution, but I really want to be here to try to make a difference in this organization and its future. And so both of them put me to work fairly aggressively. And, both have have done, great things. Gable Stage, 5 years, the budget has doubled. We just got the approval for the Coconut Grove Playhouse, where Gable Stage will be operating the theater there when that's done in 3 years or so.
That's amazing.
Mosaic Miami, we're doing probably 4 or 5 times the amount of programming we did a few years ago. That's really due to Matt Anderson and his
They definitely
genius.
have a lot of great shows if anybody hasn't checked them out.
Yes. Come to Gable Stage. The season will open in September. It's terrific. So anyway, so I got involved with both nonprofits, and I find it enormously fulfilling. I think we are. I genuinely believe we are put here to make a difference in the community. One of my mentors is the legendary Dave Lawrence, and I have seen the work that Dave has done over the year. Dave could have retired nicely after leaving the Miami Herald many years ago, and instead he started this Second Life.
Done so many different things.
The children's movement, the children's trust, everything he does in the community. And so I want to be Dave Lawrence when I grow up.
I think we all would do.
Yes.
All right. In closing, I usually like to close with our guests with the quick 3. And so I'm going to ask 3 quick questions, and you give me half a sentence to answer those questions. So a Miami story you wish you have covered or edited?
Elian Gonzalez. I was out of town at a fellowship in California when that happened, and I was not part of that.
A headline about your career that would surprise your younger self?
He started his own business.
One word every leader should remember during a crisis? I like the
Listen.
Listen. I like the fact you thought about these. Like you chose his words wisely. George, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate the insights. And the conversation in general, the perspective you brought about journalism, leadership, and others, and also business, I think are really valuable. And I think it also kind of highlights the importance of trust and reliability, not just in the work in journalism, but also integrity in our own businesses. And thank you to everyone who helped make today's show's conversation possible. Thank you to Michael and Grant Miller and the entire Miami Community Newspaper team. Our new producer Leslie and Anthony behind the desk there, making us look good. City Build Sessions is really about the people who make the city what it is. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoy this episode, please subscribe and leave a review and share it with anyone who cares about building stronger cities. Cities are known by their skylines, but they're built by people. Stay curious, stay caffeinated, and keep building. My name is Irvan Augustine, and this is City Built. People, culture, business, and places. We'll see you next time.